Hi guys, today I'm going to be looking at strategies to use in planning an answer, so how to plan an answer for the Dickinson exam question. So just to remind you, the total length of time for your exam is 2 hours, 1 hour for the Dorian Gray question and then 1 hour for the Dickinson question. So the example question we're going to look at today is here. We're going to look at the question, discuss ways in which Dickinson presents death in I felt a funeral in my brain. Okay, and then we're given the reminder here that you must refer to language, imagery, and also verse form, as well as consider how this relates to other Dickinson poems we have studied. Okay, so here the examiner actually gives you some very helpful indicators as to how to structure your answer. Okay, and one way of doing that, as we've discussed in class, is to think about allocating a minimum of one paragraph that looks at Dickinson's use of language, another that looks at imagery, and then another that looks at verse form. Okay, and then another very important element of this question is about considering how this relates to other Dickinson poems, which of course brings us to the comparison element. Okay, so looking at this question, first need to identify what's the theme, what's the key word. So here we're looking at the presentation of death. Okay, so already I can start thinking about this comparison element. There are lots of poems that I could connect the theme of death to. For example, let's think about perhaps This World Is Not Conclusion as one example. Another example may be After Great Pain. After great pain, a formal feeling comes. So already I'm starting to generate a list of possible poems that I want to connect to, just to remind me, okay, for later. Now, as you'll be aware, the poem that features in the question, okay, you will be provided with a copy of that poem. All of the other poems that you wish to make comparisons to, you will need to know from memory. Okay, so we'll have a look then at the poem I Felt a Funeral in My Brain, which will be provided to you in the exam. Okay, now I advise you to spend time reading the poem through at least twice. Okay, you should really allocate anything between 5 and 10 minutes for planning. Okay, so that's sufficient time for reading the poem through twice. The first time you read the poem, you should be looking to refresh your memory of the poem, of the themes, of any particular language features that might be interesting to discuss later in your answer. And then the second time through, you should be thinking of selecting those specific quotations that you wish to use in your answer. So let's take it through. Let's look at this poem. I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service, like a drum, kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and I in silence some strange race wrecked, solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing them. Okay, so after my first reading of the poem, I'm starting to remember that this is a poem that describes the experience of death by somebody who is experiencing the feeling of being in a coffin and all those physical sensations that are starting to break down as they approach the time of death. Okay, I'm reminded that it's written in first person as well, So I'm thinking in terms of other comparisons I could make. Perhaps I heard a fly buzz when I died would also be an interesting element of comparison. Now the second time I read the poem through, what I'll be doing then is going back to my essay question and remembering those three elements that I need to be talking about, so language, imagery and verse form. Okay, so let's start to have a look at some quotes that I might decide to use. Okay, now for language, I think the quote that I'm going to go for is this one in the first stanza, and it's this line, kept treading till it seemed. Okay, I'm drawn to this quote partly because of the repetition of treading. Okay, the repetition of treading and the emphasis of this kind of sort of foreboding sensation as the narrator approaches death. And I'm also attracted to this quotation because it reminds me of a part of the poem, after a great pain a formal feeling comes, and when she refers to the mechanical feet going round. So it's almost as though when you approach death, as the narrator approaches death, she starts to sort of lose control of her physical sensations and her physical movements. Okay, so this will be my quote for language. So that's going to be my first paragraph where I talk about language. Okay, now I need to think about imagery as well, and the part that I'm going to decide to look at is here. It's this line where she talks about boots of lead. Okay, so that kind of imagery that's coming across here is to do with heaviness, and there's a kind of oppressive feeling as well. Okay, and that really makes me think again of after a great pain, where she talks about she actually refers to lead again and has sort of the imagery of very heavy rock. But do you know what? I've already compared with that poem. It'd be good to show a wider understanding of a wider variety of poems. So I'm going to actually talk about A Bird Came Down the Walk, because the imagery there isn't of heaviness, but that it's more of a kind of light fluid. So I'm going to remind myself that those are my birds there. I'm going to remind myself, and I'm going to talk about the quote about oars dividing the ocean there. So I'll come back to that. Okay, so far we've got a potential quote for language, one for imagery. So I need something to do with verse form. Okay, now in some ways this is the hardest one. Okay, Dickinson poems are extremely rich in language and imagery, and verse form can be quite difficult to sort of talk about and compare. But if I just sort of zoom out here, we can see that what's typical of Dickinson poems is that her stanzas are 4 lines long. Okay, and if you follow with me here from beginning to end, you can see that all of her stanzas are 4 lines long. Okay, so that could be something to comment on. Often that can be seen as the poet's attempt to sort of bring some order to some sort of chaotic and traumatic experience. So that could be something that I talk about. But remembering that I also need to compare to another poem, I think what I'm going to hone in on it here is that if we look at the last line of each stanza, okay, with the exception of stanza 3, you can see that the last lines always end with her characteristic use of the dash. Okay, so I'm going to use that as a point of comparison and talk about the way that sort of open-endedness and the idea that there may be, even after death, the promise of something more in an afterlife. Okay, and that in that case I'm going to talk about link to the poem This World Is Not Conclusion, because I think that fits quite neatly into there. Okay, so by now we're probably about 5 or 6 minutes into the exam. Okay, we've read the question, we've identified the key elements of the question, started to generate a list of poems that we could compare to. Okay, and then we've read our poem through twice and we have actually extracted relevant quotes. Okay, so we're almost ready to go, almost. Okay, what I'd like to do now then is start thinking about actually mapping out my essay and my plan. Okay, so here I'm going to start borrowing from the triangle model. Okay, so I'm going to put a triangle here to remind me that of my introduction, and that of course the tip of the triangle is going to be my thesis statement. Okay, and that triangle obviously appears at the end as well. Okay, where we return to the thesis. Okay, but we'll come back to that. For the time being, what I've done now, and you'll see here, is that I've taken the 3 quotes that I selected from my reading of the poem just earlier, and I've written them out here. Okay, written them out, because these are going to form the main body of my essay. So I've got paragraph 1, paragraph 2, and paragraph 3. Okay, now what's missing then is a topic sentence to go with each of these quotes. Okay, and in this case what's really helpful is then to write a topic sentence to go with each quote that clearly relates back to the question, okay, on the theme of death, and then that will really help give me the building blocks into actually writing my essay. Okay, so in terms of this quote, I kept treading till it seemed that sense was breaking through. Here my topic sentence is going to be as follows. I'm going to be talking about how, I'm going to change pen here so it shows up, how Dickinson presents death as something physically paralysing. There's this real sort of emphasis on the physical breakdown of the body as one approaches death, and that fits in quite nicely with the comparison as well. So she presents death as physically paralysing. Okay, and that's a nice, clean, concise topic sentence, okay, that I can use to begin my paragraph. So I'm pretty good to go with my first paragraph. Okay, moving on to the second then, we've got this imagery used, a very heavy, oppressive imagery. Okay, so here, what I want to say here is that Dickinson presents death as heavy and burdensome as well. Okay, so again, I don't need to, these topic sentences don't need to be wordy and lengthy. Okay, need to be clear, precise, and obviously you're showing and understanding and linking back to the theme of death as also. Okay, and then my third quote, where I talk about verse form in some detail, will be the quote, "and finished knowing then." So if you remember, I wanted to start looking at the use of the dash here. In here, unlike the first 2 paragraphs where I'm talking about something very oppressive and challenging, here I feel that she's presenting death as almost opening up a new door, opening up access to the afterlife. So there's more hope here. So here I want to say that, you know, could even start with a connective in contrast, okay, to show that element of comparison within the poem. Okay, in contrast, Dickinson also portrays a sense of hope in the existence of an afterlife. So I am focusing on death, but more death in terms of what comes after death. Okay, so that's another perspective to take. The existence of an afterlife. Okay, so we've got here really a nice clear structure when it comes to looking at my 3 paragraphs that I'm going to talk about. Okay, I've got an interesting paragraph to go with on language, imagery, and verse form. Okay, and all of my topic sentences then here are linking to death, okay, which is what we want for the key question. And then at this point, before I get started, I may also just go back to my the copy of my poem and just remember some of the poems that I'm going to compare to, okay, because remember that element of comparison is really important. So I may even draw the letter C and then just remind myself that I'm going to be comparing to after a great pain in this case. Okay, good. Okay, we're almost ready to start our answer. Okay, but we need to remember obviously our triangles, the tips of our triangles. So I want to think of an interesting thesis statement in terms of death. Okay, so one way to do this, it's easier to do it now that I've actually got my topic sentences, and I can see that what I'm going to be discussing is that death is something very traumatic, physically paralysing, oppressive, but I'm also suggesting that Dickinson feels that there's an element of hope as well, that death, it doesn't have to be the final and the end to everything. So I'm looking to say something perhaps like, I'm going to discuss how Dickinson presents perhaps suffering related to death, but reminds us of the hope to come. Okay, so now I have a thesis statement to weave into my introduction, okay, and then also to bring back to my conclusion, okay. And here, when I explore my quotes, I want to be linking back to that idea that yes, she's showing suffering in death, yes, she's showing an element of fear and caution, okay, yes, she's showing the physical breakdown of the body. But when she comes to look at actually what comes after, there is a sense of hope and faith and belief and optimism. Okay, so let's just recap then on the stages to go through in how to our plan of action, let's call it. Okay, so remembering then, Dickinson's question is an hour long. I would spend to plan between, I've said, sort of between 5 to 10 minutes, okay? And in that time, the first thing you need to do is read the question. Okay, what we've done today is we've read the question, we've identified the keyword, and we started to generate a list of poems that we could compare to, okay? You then need to go and read the poem, okay? If you remember, we read the poem once through just to refresh our memories, and then we read it once again and annotated for the quotes that we could use in relation to the question, okay? Once we annotated our quotes, we then decided on our topic sentences. Excuse me. I would aim for a minimum of 3, okay? So 1 on language, 1 on imagery, and 1 on verse form. Okay, that's the minimum. Obviously, if you feel that you can do more. You could do more than 1, okay, but as a minimum, to make sure that you're answering the question, meeting the criteria, that would be my guideline. After we have our topic sentences, we read through our topic sentences, and then we think of our thesis statement. Okay, we think about what's the tip of our triangle going to be. What are we trying to explore? What makes our analysis on death more interesting than, or a bit different from the other people who are writing on this question, okay? And then once you've got all of that in place, once you've got a map, okay, a map of your topic sentences, okay, the quotes that you want to use, comparisons that you want to make, then you're ready to go, okay? You're ready to go and answer your question. So, I hope this has been helpful. Please stay tuned where I'll be sharing my example of answering this question, where I'll be using this plan, okay, and writing in timed conditions. Okay, thanks very much then.